Reached in my pocket before class to find the button, found it really easily, and then can't find it when class starts. We are in Hebrews chapter 8. We're glad you're here. We have a few people visiting with us. We're thankful that you're with us this morning. Continuing our study in the book of Hebrews. Before we dive into the text too much this morning, we talked a little bit on Wednesday about the point that's made in, well, I guess we're going to jump into the text sort of, but a point that's made in verses 7 and 8 of Hebrews 8, and where it says, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, 'Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord.'" So then we have the quote from Jeremiah chapter 32 or 31. And so the question that was brought up on Wednesday was and this wasn't a question from the individual specifically. They were talking about a question they could hear someone outside bringing up. And that was essentially, is it not convenient that he finds fault with the people when he was the one who created the law? Could he not have created the law more simple or simpler, so that the people could have kept it more easily, or that more people would have kept it or could have kept it more easily? Because what we talked about was that it is a law that ultimately, while we said it is possible to keep it perfectly, the reality is that when we look at all of humankind, no one has. And so the question becomes, well, couldn't he not have made the law simpler so that at least some or more could have kept it perfectly and not have fallen into sin so that he could blame them? I think that was the gist of the question. Essentially, the point is, God's the lawmaker, so is it not convenient that he creates a law and then finds fault with the people for not keeping the law? Could he not have made it simpler so that they could have kept it, so that he would not have had to have found fault with everyone? And so that was the question. I brought up a second question that I have actually heard. I'm not saying this individual hasn't heard that question. I just haven't heard that specific one. But essentially the question that I heard is similar, and that is, why would God create a world in which he gave man freedom of will, and then created them with that free will, knowing that the majority of us were going to disobey him, not accept his free gift of eternal life, and go to hell? Why would God create a world in which he knew most of the people that he made were going to be lost eternally? And so they are somewhat similar, I think. And so the question becomes, how would you address that? The individual who formulated the question was Andrew. Said he was still working on his answer. I told him I was going to bring that back up on Sunday morning, not to put him on the spot, for him to have formulated his answer and want to share it. But I was going to take a stab at it, but I didn't know if anybody else had thought about that question more over the course of the last few days or not, and wanted to try to approach it. I mean, one of the statements that I made on Wednesday night, which I do believe is true, is that ultimately there are going to be questions with regard to things regarding God and eternity and the world and the way things are and all of that we're going to have, that ultimately there is not going to be an answer to. And in some ways, I don't know, I mean, to some extent, there are things that we accept on faith, not blindly, but on the basis of the fact that God has, in the evidence that we have presented before us and that we have hopefully examined, God has demonstrated his nature and the reality of that nature to an extent that we trust him in the situations where things don't make sense to us. God's ways are not our ways, and we acknowledge that the Bible says that. But the truth is, God doesn't think like we think. And so ultimately the question becomes, do you believe that God is a good God, a benevolent God, And are you willing to trust him in areas where you can't wrap your brain around the way in which he has reasoned to come to the conclusion he's come to? I mean, that's the question all of us have to ultimately answer for ourselves. Has God demonstrated his goodness and righteousness to an extent that we're willing to trust him in areas where we don't understand? And I mean, I think most of us have answered it with a yes. He is worthy of that trust, but not everyone's going to come to that conclusion. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm going to throw another wrench in the works
another wrench.
here.
We're going to keep throwing wrenches in this thing until we can't get them out.
Is that not the basis for what Muhammad said, and the reason, the revelation that he was given, and also John Smith, that we were not keeping the Christian law perfectly, and that God needed to reveal a different way in the meantime?
I don't remember if that was the basis of that or not. But the reality is that, I mean, to some extent, it doesn't matter which law system you come up with, does it? It ultimately doesn't, because, I mean, how many Muslims are there out there that keep the Islamic law perfectly, or would claim to? I mean, maybe Muhammad would. I don't know whether he would have or not. I didn't live when he lived, and I'm not going to attribute motives or thoughts to him that I don't know that he had. But whether he did or not, how many Muslims do you know of that you think would claim to keep Islamic law perfectly? And I don't think that I know of any who would. I don't believe there are any. There aren't any Seventh-day Adventists. There aren't any Mormons that I'm aware of, or not Seventh-day Adventist, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Aren't any Mormons that I know of who would claim to keep the law of Christ as they see it revealed in the Bible and the Book of Mormon. I don't know of any of them that would claim to have kept it perfectly either. So the reality is, it doesn't really matter which law system you come up with. I don't know that any of us keep any of them perfectly. And I don't know that it matters how easy you make it to some extent. Yes, sir.
Yeah, concerning the things you said, I thought it'd be profitable to remind us that some questions we can't answer and some answers we can't question.
There are. I mean, there are some questions that we can't answer, but I do think that for those of us who are very analytical, it at least, and I'm speaking from a person who is, it is helpful to me to wrestle with those questions and at least come to some kind of satisfaction in my own mind. Because there are reasonings that create doubts and lead to other questions that are questions ultimately as a Christian. We don't want to be questioning the existence of God, the reality of the inspiration of Scripture, and whether or not we've put our trust in the right place or not. And so we have to, on some level, and I don't know that everybody has to deal with this, but we have to, on some level, grapple with these kinds of questions. And there have been questions that have been brought to me before that I've looked at. Some of you have pointed me in the direction of some of these questions that you've heard asked. And I've asked the question, I've looked at the statements that are made by the people who've asked the question, and my thought is, well, what if that's true? What if that's true? And I mean, the reality is that if what they say is true, then the Bible isn't inspired and God doesn't really exist, and my faith has been for naught. Well, do I want that? And do I want to just say, oh, yeah, that can't be true then? Or do I want to wrestle with that? And in my mind, I have to wrestle with that. I have to deal with that on some level to my satisfaction. And I stand before you today as a guy who's done that a lot of times over the course of the 26 years that I've been a Christian. And obviously, the conclusion I've come to at every turn is that God does exist, the Bible is inspired, and my faith is well placed by by following Him and trusting in Him. So, but I have wrestled with those questions before. And I do think it's helpful for me and for my faith. I think it's one of the things that's made my faith as strong as it is. And I do feel like I have a strong faith. And I do feel like it equips me to help other people who perhaps are searching honestly and looking for those things, who think in some of the same kinds of ways that I do. So, now, here's the point I made just a moment ago. I don't think there's a law that's easy enough. Joyce has something up here, John. I don't think there's a law simple enough that any of us would keep it perfectly. What possibly could be the only exception? And why is it that none of us would keep it perfectly no matter how simple it is? And why could there possibly be an exception? And I know, again, I'm asking you to think like I'm thinking, which is a scary place and nobody wants to be there. But see if you can come up with something as far as where my line of thinking's going. Why is it that nobody can keep a law no matter how simple it is? I want you to think about, typically, from your perspective as a person, who is usually the source of the law that you are called on to keep. Now, the easy one for all of us as Christians sitting in a church building is, who writes the law? God does. But remove yourself from the church building for a moment. Take it outside the realm of religion. Who writes the laws? But do you really? We're talking about a law system. Who really writes the law? Whether we're talking about the Islamic law, or the laws handed through the Book of Mormon, or the laws of the United States of America, or the laws of the state of Indiana, who writes the laws? Man does, but someone other than me, right? How many people exist, even within this building, that you agree with 100%? I'm asking an honest question. I think this is germane to the topic that we're talking about. Nobody, right? So the only way in which we might write a law that was simple enough for us to keep is if Greg's point was true, and that is that the only law that I had to follow was the law that exists in my own mind, right? I can keep that law. That's really easy. I'm my own boss. I tell myself what I can and what I can't do. I have no problem keeping that law because I'm the one who originated it. The problem, I think, with any law system, and the reason why it's so difficult for us to keep, no matter how simple, is that someone else wrote it. And we don't agree with someone else, I don't care who it is, 100% of the time. It's even true with regard to God. We want to agree with God 100% of the time, but because we don't think like God thinks, we don't reason like God reasons, there are times when God calls on us to do something or not do something, and we look at it and we reason through it, and what do we think? Just throwing out answers. Anything goes. What do we think? God says you should do this, or God says you should not do this, and we reason through it. And in our circumstances, in our situation, what do we think? Okay, that is a thought that can go through our mind. Is the penalty for not doing it worse than... Okay, so that's a thought. What else might we think? We wish something was different. We look at it and say, well, surely, we begin to justify for all kinds of reasons. Surely God doesn't expect me to do that in this circumstance. And we even reason through our mind. God is a merciful, understanding God. He wouldn't want me to do that here. Do we know that to be true? We reason it in our mind, but do we know that to be true? Oh, God would be okay with us not doing it here. Do we know that? No, we don't know that. We've justified it in our mind. We've reasoned through that in our head because that makes sense to us. But maybe God does want us to do it in this very moment, no matter what it costs us, no matter how difficult it is. Maybe God really does want us to do it, and we've reasoned in our mind and we've decided, oh, it's okay for me to go a different direction. We've rewritten the law in our own mind according to what we think God would want, even though God hasn't revealed that clearly, and we do that, and that becomes a sin and a violation of the law of God. So my point is just, in some ways, the reason why we don't keep law perfectly is because the law originates outside of ourselves, and at some point in our own minds, it's what Eve did in the Garden of Eden. Satan, yes, put the seed of doubt in her mind, but what Eve did in the garden was she was convinced by the lie that Satan presented, which he presents to us all the time, by the way, that God's just holding you back. God's just trying to keep you from being the fullness of what He created you to be in the first place. And if you eat this fruit, it's going to open up a whole new realm for you. Oh, it did, but not a realm she was going to like. And God knew that. Okay, so that's one aspect of this. Joyce has something. Oh, no. Another aspect of this is the law that God wrote for us. Why did He give us the laws that He did? And I'm specifically thinking about the moral laws. Don't think for the moment about the laws with regard to sacrifices and all of those things. For one, they would have never been necessary had we not sinned, correct? So thinking about the moral law itself, what is the reason why God gave us the laws that He gave us? Guardrails for our own benefit. They are, as Moses identified in Deuteronomy, for our good always. So could God have simplified the law? Why? Why not? Emily's shaking her head no, and I agree with her. Because if God had changed the law to make it easier for us, what would He have had to have done? He would have either had to have permitted things that were what? Not good for us. If he hadn't identified them as sinful, as law-breaking, they wouldn't be sin. But they would have been bad for us or bad for somebody else. And He would have had to have, or He would have had to have eliminated things that we should do that, again, were either for our good or for the good of others who were around us. And so God couldn't do that because everything He gave us is for our good. So He couldn't change, He couldn't alter the law to make it easier and still be true to what He wanted for us in the first place. So there's that aspect of it. Anybody want to throw anything else into this mix? I mean, this is a deep question with a lot of facets. Jeff's got something.
So if God had simplified the
Greg's got
law,
something.
there's a discussion in Romans chapter 7.
Yes.
So what shall we say? Is the law sin? May it never be. This is 7 verse 7. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. This is the law of Moses.
Right.
For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandments, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. So the Roman writer says, the law itself produced in me coveting of every kind. Had the law been simplified, however, and said, love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. If we had simplified that upon which all the law and the prophets is built, and there had been no mention of coveting, how can I love my neighbor and covet my neighbor's possessions or his wife? I can't do it, can I?
No.
So how is it that the law by saying, don't covet, produced in me all kinds of coveting. So if anything violated the basic underlying principle of treat other people the way you want to be treated and love God,
Right.
does it have to be enumerated? Do you have to say, now, it's not treating your neighbor like you want to be treated when you want his lawnmower or when you want his spouse? Do you have to say that? Because isn't that violating the law of submitting yourself in love to other people? And the answer is yes, because we are of a fleshly nature. Things were spelled out for us that really, if you think about it, shouldn't have to be spelled out at all.
Yes.
Because it's pretty obvious that's not a loving thing to do to somebody else.
And you're right. They shouldn't have to be spelled out. But I mean, I remember as preaching full time, one of the things I got asked to do more of all the time was we needed to be more practical. And what they meant by that was we want you to take the principles and enumerate what that's supposed to look like in all the different facets of our lives. And so that was going to be my next question, but you already addressed it, was, so if God had said, love your neighbor as yourself, but didn't say, don't covet your neighbor's wife, would that have kept you from coveting your neighbor's wife? And the answer is no. So God had to spell it out for us so we knew and understood all of the ways that we were not loving our neighbor as ourselves. Because otherwise, we would again rationalize, justify in our own mind different things, and we would still do those things whether he enumerated them or not. But, as you said, and as Paul said in Romans 7, outlining those things for us in detail also brought them to our mind. Because, the reality is, we even talk about this as parents, don't we? I know I've said as a parent, well, I thought this with regard to this, but I wasn't going to tell it to whichever child it was that I was thinking of at the time because I didn't want to put that idea in their head. They don't always need me to put the idea in their head. Somebody else might do it for me. But the point is, we needed God to outline those things for us. But in doing so, as Paul in Romans 7 says, by inspiration, there's some sense in which an idea we hadn't previously thought of now becomes the catalyst for our mind to think about using that in a way that's contrary to the will of God. So, and I think that's the point of Romans 7. The law brought attention to covetousness, and now I covet all kinds of stuff.
Well, there's another point here. I'm not done.
Go ahead.
The fact that I've been told under the Mosaical 10 Commandments not to covet my neighbor's wife said nothing about coveting the lawnmower. But I don't covet his wife. I don't covet his lawnmower. I covet his lawn. His lawn is much prettier than our lawn. And that's my fault because I don't want to do anything to take care of it. So how is it you're going to write the law in such a way that I'm doing all right by not coveting certain possessions, but there's other things. His motorcycle's pretty nice too. I like his motorcycle now that I think about it. But so that you could just keep adding.
Right.
At what point do you say this is ridiculous when you say don't covet your neighbor's lawn? Right. And that's why the law was a law of slavery, according to Romans. You just can't. You can't write it all. And I said earlier, when who writes the law, you took it as, yes, I write the law for me because I do what I want. But I also draft legislation
Yes.
for the state of Indiana.
Yes.
And we sometimes have on the books things that you would look at and say, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard of. You know why we sometimes have that stuff in the books? It's because when someone has done something bad to someone else, and we look through the criminal code, Title 34, we look through the criminal code and say, we just can't find the law that says you can't treat other people that way. We have to write it down so that county prosecutors can then point to a passage,
Right.
just like we do.
Right.
They have to point to a passage. Why am I being arrested? Title
'Cause you
34,
violated this
Chapter
law.
7. You violated this law.
Right.
And until we wrote it down, you couldn't have violated it.
Yeah.
And all the time. I'm not in criminal courts. I'm very happy for that. That's not my area of expertise. But we have criminal courts and we have judicial, our two committees that all the time have law enforcement officers and prosecutors come and testify and said, we wanted to charge someone with something and it just wasn't in the book.
Right.
So you need to change the law so that we can charge the next guy that does this for this same criminal act.
Right.
And you get to that point of this is absurd in human law, and it spells out the point why God also says this is absurd. He says in chapter 8 of Romans, I think it is, this is futility. God subjected mankind to this futility. What is this futility? Trying to keep a book of all the laws that are the do's and don'ts. It's a futile effort because no matter what you write down, someone's going to think of something else that violates a principle that you didn't write down.
Right.
So where do you stop that? You stop that by changing the law into a different mindset. And that's what the new covenant tries to do. And that's why when you talk about practical preaching, if we get to the point of saying, well, you can do this, but you can't do that according to this principle,
Right.
we might as well just get into the business of writing the
Down
law.
every law.
And our Bibles are going to become volumes 1 through 17. And I'm not making that up.
And then there'll be more volumes to come later because somebody will find ways to get through.
I've got about 80 pounds of books in my bookshelf at home, and they're books of Indiana law. And it's outdated because we've written a lot since that was published.
Right.
Have I made my point? Do you understand what I'm saying by
I
this?
do. Jeff's got something.
Well, I was just thinking about how, when we talk about the law like this and why God won't dumb down the laws for us, how we have to look at his attributes and how we have to look at his attribute of holiness. And, how a lot of students want the teachers to adjust their grades and things to their benefit.
Right.
Well, I was just thinking, because of God's holiness, he can't change that, and he can't dumb down the laws just for our benefit, because it would affect his holiness.
Yes. Well, and we're not going to get to be like him. We're never going to get to be like him on the basis of our own doing. And so he's provided a way that we can be like him through the blood of his son. And I mean, that is a gift, and a beautiful gift at that we can stand holy and righteous before him, not because we are holy and righteous, but because Jesus was the sacrifice that provides for our atonement and our forgiveness and wipes our slate clean. Yes, sir.
So I wanted to try to maybe go back to the original question of, is it unfair of God to find fault with them? And so Dad looked at Romans 7. I was looking at Romans 9 in formulating what I think is a satisfying answer to that question in my mind. Starting in verse 19, I'll just read a little bit. He actually outlines pretty much the very question. He says, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory, for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory?" So I think this passage in Romans does two things. The first is the point that Jim Pedigo made, and it is there are aspects that we cannot argue our righteousness before God. There is no way we can fully argue our innocence before a perfect God.
Right.
We can't say to him, you're wrong for making the law the way that it is, and it's unfair because I should deserve to be let in. We can't even begin to make that argument before a perfect being. So that's one. The second point is, I think that this passage indicates maybe the reason why God made an quotation marks imperfect law, and that's in verse 22, What if God, desiring to show his wrath and make known his power? Well, if I was God and I wanted to show my wrath and my power, what would I do? I could bend the laws however I wanted to just force people to be saved. I could just say, there's no laws. I'm just going to let mercy do all the work and everybody does whatever they want. But God has those dials. Well, if you crank the dial all the way over to mercy, where's the righteousness? Where's the goodness of God in doing that? You already addressed that point. If you crank it all the way to the other side and you just beat people into submission to being perfectly obedient, there is no room for mercy in a world where disobedience is impossible. The mercy of God disappears when there is no more sin, when there is no more injustice. And I think that's what's indicated here. God wants to show his wrath and his power, but he's patient instead so that he can make known the riches. What's it say? So he can make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy. And so I think that gives us a picture of maybe the reason why God has ordained things the way that he has.
Created the world the way that he created it. It demonstrates both aspects. And the reality is, did God ever intend for any of us to get to him on the basis of our own law keeping? Did he ever intend for us to be saved because we're righteous? No. But did he present a way for all of us to be saved? Yes. So in the end, who is to blame? And this goes back to the devil's biggest lie. Who is to blame for my sin? Who? We are. Who is to blame if I'm not saved in the end? I am. So, I mean, the bottom line is I'm accountable. And God has set up his system in such a way that ultimately, as Andrew said, I don't know that he was addressing the same point, but he made the same point, we don't have a leg to stand on when we try to stand before God and present our own case. we will lose every time. And so there is no basis upon which we can stand before God and justify ourselves in any way. But we don't have to. God has provided a means of justification through Christ, and that's what this book is about. That this wonderful covenant has these wonderful promises because of the wonderful sacrifice of Jesus. And the covenant that God established is not a covenant in which we were ever expected to keep the law perfectly, but a covenant in which mercy is to be found, and ultimately our sins are completely removed, taken away, and God will remember them no more. Yes, sir.
Well, there's a couple of things. One is now we see why the Pharisees had their own set of books of the law,
Yes.
and they were trying to follow those as opposed to just God's law, because they kept trying to codify all the exceptions and all the rules and regulations that weren't there. So they actually tried to write the books with the laws that were in there.
Yes.
But following up at your point, what's the statement that's made continually in Judges? And the man did what was right in his own eyes. But then we go to, even before we had the law, we go back to Genesis chapter 6. When you ask me what the what we call the the law before the law was. We don't really know, because we don't know how God commanded them to do things. But he said in verse 5, I guess it was, and then then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually.
Right.
So when man's left without a law, or without a codified law of some kind, his intents and his thoughts are continually evil.
I mean,
except for
Noah. Noah followed God and found favor.
But if you look at the genealogy, or if you look at the timeline, there were other men of God that were still alive at this time that we know and read about in the Bible.
Right.
So it wasn't just Noah wasn't the only biblical character alive at the time that this is said.
Right. All right. Anything else about that really ponderous question? I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, you will get questions, if not exactly like that, questions similar to it. I've had them. We got to wrestle with them. Yes, sir.
A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to stay with a group of men. One of them was a Jewish individual who was trying to follow the exact law in his life. You know, we watched him. It was such a burden, but he was cooking one night on the stove. Of course, it's kosher. Everything has to be kosher.
Right.
And his a panhandle was sticking out. And for safety reasons, I walked up and turned that pan, and he was cooking a piece of meat there. And he was very, you know, he got angry with me. He had to throw that nice piece of meat away. And that's when the law sunk into me, because I saw the burden, I saw the pain that he was in. He was not happy with the law. He was following a law that said he had to throw that meat away.
Right.
He was angry with his law. He hated his law at that moment. He was angry at me, and I was only trying to help him.
Right.
Later on in that visit or that stay, me and a couple other guys spoke to him about the burden that we were seeing him, you know, trying to live as, you know, as following the Jewish law. And we talked about the freedom that is available. You know, he was having to do these prayers 3 times a day. It was just constant pain in his life. And he actually started to see and listen a little bit. So the point is, the law is not, it's painful, it's not attainable. It was put there to teach.
Right.
And I experienced an individual who was seeing firsthand the pain of his own law.
The burden.
And the burden, and he actually heard us and saw the freedom that, you know, could be possible if he were to leave that.
Right.
But that was the purpose. The law was doing to him what it was doing 2,000 years ago. It was burdening people and making them groan for something to free them from it.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, the New Testament talks about the burden of the law. And Jesus even talked about the Pharisees preaching and teaching burdens that they themselves are unwilling to keep. Here's a question, though. Do you think Jesus viewed the law of Moses, not all the laws and traditions of the Jewish leadership? You think he viewed the law of God as burdensome? It's not really a trick question. Yeah, I honestly don't think the law itself, the way that it was written by God, was ever intended to be a burden. And when the New Testament uses those terms, and Jesus used those terms of the Pharisees, I don't think he was primarily referencing the law as God gave it, because the law as God gave it did provide allowances for people to grapple with this principle and that, which at times seem to be at odds with one another. I know you as a Christian, we as Christians have experienced that there seem to be 2 commands that how can I keep both of them at the same time? And so they wrestled with that, and Jesus speaks of the fact that God preferred mercy and not judgment, not just a strict law keeping. And so instances like, for example, when the priests gave David and his men the showbread, who was the showbread for? It was for the priests and Levites. It was for those who were serving in the temple. And yet he gave it to David. Jesus seems to say that was permitted because it was given as an allowance to the priests. Did they have the right then to take it and to provide it for David and his men when they were in need? And the answer, according to Jesus, seems to have been yes. And it seems as though the Jewish leadership would have understood that principle. The Jews were not permitted to do work on the Sabbath day, but yet the priests offered double the sacrifices. Was that work? Yeah, it was twice as much work as they typically did on a regular day. So they worked on that day. What if your neighbor's ox fell in a ditch? Would you help him get it out? Does that work? Yeah, but it's permitted. So it was never intended to be a burden. The Jews had made it a burden, as Dan said, by drawing up all these traditions, orally and then later written, that surrounded it to hedge it in to make sure we never did anything that was possibly going to be a violation of the law. And that was not God's intention. He was designing the law for their good. The Sabbath wasn't designed to be a burden to keep people from helping people when they were in need. It was designed to be a means of given prescribed rest for men who were working. That's the purpose of it. It was for man, not man for the Sabbath, Jesus says. And so we've looked at all of those things, and the end point of this text is we didn't keep the law perfectly. The Jews didn't. We don't. God never expected us to. And so instead, after showing us what it looked like to have a law system in which over and over again the people had to keep offering blood sacrifices because of their sins, God provides a new covenant, a new law, a New Testament in which what is the theme? Salvation, true righteousness, true holiness through a single sacrifice that was made by the perfect Lamb of God, the Son of God, who lived perfectly before God according to the law as it was revealed at that time. And as a result of that, we can be welcomed in the family of God and be righteous and blameless and holy before Him because, as He says in verse 12, I will be merciful toward their iniquities and I will remember their sins no more. That is the end result of this covenant. Not a covenant where year after year, day after day, constantly we were reminded I am sinful and I have fallen short of doing the will of God and I need these animal sacrifices to atone for me and to make me clean and sanctify me before God. We can be holy and righteous because of what God has done for us through Jesus Christ. Should you write that law in your mind and on your heart? Verse 10. Yeah, the Jews should have done that in the first place. And some of them did. The ones who were faithful did. They wrote those laws on their hearts and in their minds so that they knew them backwards and forwards because they wanted to be pleasing to God. They knew they weren't perfect, but they didn't view the law as a burden. They viewed the law as a means by which they could draw closer to God, be more like God, and be pleasing in His sight. And that's what people should do today. We write God's laws on our minds and in our hearts, not because we have any idea in our minds that we're going to keep it perfectly and that the more good we do, the more we justify ourselves before God, but that we want to be like a God who loves us that much, who gave His Son for us to sanctify and cleanse us so that we could be with Him eternally. Why wouldn't you want to serve that God? Why would you not want to walk with Him? Why would you not want to be more like Him in every way that you could? And so we write the laws on our minds and in our hearts, not because we think that by keeping the law we somehow make ourselves right before Him, but because we want to be like Him and He's given us this wonderful gift. So how could I do anything but strive with all of my being to be as pleasing in His sight as I possibly can? And so that's what we work toward. And in speaking of that covenant, verse 12 says, He makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. I want to talk briefly about that statement in verse 13 with regard to it vanishing away. In light of a statement that's made in both Ephesians 2 and Colossians 2 of the old law being nailed to the cross, why does he say vanishing as in present tense, happening now, vanishing away, when those passages say it's already been nailed to the cross? So I want us to talk about that briefly before we move into chapter 9.